Hey all. We went on a little long, so we split this up into two parts. Part two will be out as early release on our Patreon and will come out on the main feed later this month. So enjoy.
Hi, welcome to Neighbor Science, the only podcast about political economy and how to use superficially democratic institutions to repress popular dissent while selling people's resources out from under them, attacking sexual freedom and other rights, and suffocating millions with a horrifying blanket of haze every year. I'm Kris, and Ryan's over there in the corner with a cold or something.
I was waiting for you to intro because I did have a thing to say.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I was interested to see how good your breath control would be for this very long intro that you wrote, because it is kind of one big sentence.
It's one big sentence, yes. Just like
It's
the
like
one big country.
What's his name? Andrew in Minion Death Cult, when he's like reading one long run-on sentence.
It just goes and goes and goes.
It's like doing like qigong.
Right. Well, speaking of one big sentence, living in Indonesia is a bit like a life sentence for some people. So you were curious. You had a question for me, which is, why don't we ever hear anything about Indonesia, right? Like, I mean, that's a great question. I'll just go ahead with that.
We'll preface it by saying today's episode is about Indonesia and what's happening in Indonesia right now.
Right. I just jumped right into it without even thinking. So today's episode is about Indonesia.
I asked before we started, even like just in case the answer was like super complex and not worth like trying to address here. But like, we don't hear shit about Indonesia ever. Like, why is that?
Yeah. So today's about Indonesia, but I have to do a bit of history, and this will be part of it. But like, we're trying to cover the current events as a lot of shit is erupting in Indonesia right now politically. But why don't we ever hear anything about Indonesia? Well, it's probably a complicated answer that I haven't read enough about. But based on my experience growing up there, I was born and raised there, and I even as a kid, I noticed a huge sort of lack of awareness about Indonesia by anyone that is from like outside of like a 500-mile radius of Indonesia, right? Pretty much. So like people who think about Indonesia are Australians, Malaysians, Singaporeans, sometimes the Thais and Vietnamese, depending, Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, right? So like the whole East Asian seaboard is concerned with Indonesia for like trade reasons and occasional, say, like questions about like regional politics and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So like, also this is a whole fucking rabbit hole. Like if people want to know about Indonesian history and like how they relate to the rest of the planet, or like historically relate to, say, Japan or China, which is like these other stories and current developments and stuff, like it's a whole rabbit hole I really don't have time or energy to get into, and I like if you dive in you'll never come out. So why don't we ever hear anything about Indonesia? Well, it's partly because they are like logistically, much like Australia and New Zealand, they're logistically way out on the end of nothing, and yet they kind of have their own kind of like sub world, like a microcosm on the planet.
Okay.
And then also, even though they have massive historical and global economic and global political significance, maybe partly because of those things, it is in the government's best interests as a state, as a regime, or as a kind of continuum of different regimes, especially in cooperation with, say, like the U.S. regime, the Australian regime, the West, to keep that shit on the down low. So it really is just like a massive hush-hush operation. Like they keep a low profile so that they won't incur any kind of like international embarrassment and intervention and stuff.
So they're basically like Wano in One Piece.
Oh, which character is that again? It's been a while.
That's the samurai country that's like hidden from the world.
Yeah. They're just like, nah, it's cool. Don't talk about me. Me? Oh, me? No, I don't do anything. It's fine.
But they're actually controlled by, the world government.
Right. Yeah. So Indonesia is interesting. It is like fucking crawling with NGOs and resource companies and all this shit. Just
Get into
riddled.
NGOs sometime.
Ugh, man, yeah,
Really
it's a whole
touched on
thing,
that at
right?
all. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a whole thing. So they're just riddled with this. And back in, I'll kind of touch on this. But I'll give you a preview, which is when Indonesia, as we know it now, was just like a collection of colonial holdings by the Dutch and the Portuguese and the British, but mostly the Dutch. Mm. They were seen as just the East Indies, as like these colonies, right? So it was like this exotic location that to white people, right? And like, oh, that's just this distant, far-flung sort of darkest Asia kind of place, right? And then they.
What was like the I don't, maybe you won't know this offhand, but
sure.
What was like the racial conception that the Europeans had of the Indonesians?
So I think that they basically saw them as like, I'm just going to take a stab at it from like my cursory exposure to like the sort of the cultural history of like how the Dutch, like literally like the Dutch colonials themselves, and like how they interacted with the locals and how they administered things, and also some of the lingering attitudes that Indonesians have about each other and stuff. So it's important when you think about Indonesia, and you'll sort of see this flesh out in this episode as we're talking about current events a little bit. The West, so the tip of Sumatra, Aceh, is the furthest west point in Indonesia, and that's where there's like strong sort of Islamic fundamentalism, because it is basically where Islam ended up. And Islam is kind of like a culture, I guess, where it kind of like concentrated most. Yeah, because it was the furthest toward where they got a lot of their Islamic influences from, which is west of them, across the Indian Ocean, whether it was in India or Persia or Arabia or East Africa. So right, as well as of course the peninsula. But anyway, so again, this is a rabbit hole. There's rabbit holes, fucking endless rabbit holes with Indonesia.
Right.
Like just you got to be careful, because like you'll end up telling some other story by accident. So
I guess what I'm really interested in is like, is there residual white supremacy in Indonesia?
Right. Yes. Back to that. Sorry. So it's you see in a lot of like Asian countries, people using whitening creams to make themselves look more refined and beautiful in their minds, things like that. And that's just like colorism, right? But it's still obviously connected to all that. There was a kind of a path dependency situation where, and this has to do with the west-east kind of spectrum of like, in the West, you saw a lot more states developing, and the islands were generally larger and closer to continental Asia. And so they were able to concentrate and sophisticate more planned economies, but like complex things like agriculture and industry, right? And like fucking massive architectural feats, right? Like Borobudur and Prambanan and stuff, which are these like ancient like temples and palace complexes and stuff. And so, whereas in the middle and east in this archipelago, the islands tend to be smaller overall, although there's a few big ones, of course. But so these are more kind of like proper sea peoples, and like small, like really small ethnic groups that, even if they're all technically interrelated or speak similar languages, like related languages. We made it, it's complexes and bubbles and stuff, people all over the place. They were able to create states and stuff, of course, because you can create a state with two fucking people if you really feel like it, but if you really feel like it, they were not able to like create like these kind of massive sort of quote unquote civilizations. They had more like networks. So they were the most perhaps dependent on these like sort of sea routes and stuff, whereas like the Western land powers could also be sea powers, but they didn't necessarily have to be, right? So then because of that, then this kind of path dependency led to some institutional continuity in the West, and also I don't want to dare to say cultural affinity with like the Dutch or the British, but definitely a kind of like an ability to match statecraft with statecraft. And so if elites chose to collaborate and survive versus like commit suicide literally, then or like go to war and die or be ousted by that means, then they managed to kind of stick it out often and become part of like the administrative apparatus, or maintain like a titular role within like the Dutch colonial sort of thing. And so in that sense, those surviving institutions and value systems and hierarchies and stuff that were kind of affected and mutated by the Dutch presence and other colonial presences, many of them have survived to this day in at least name, and have of course influenced the way that people think about themselves as Indonesians, or themselves as like any given ethnic group, such as the Javanese, which is the biggest one. So of course, a lot of the people I think who identify the most with this kind of hierarchical institutional Indonesia tend to fall into that nationalist camp that is very influential and problematic there. Because the other traditionally the other two major political blocs were the Islamists, who of course identify with the Islamic world as their source of like legitimacy and code, right?
Okay.
And then there were of course the leftists and communists generally, but typically identified with the Communist Party, which were for the most part purged by way of massacre and being forced underground. So that is also relevant, but we'll get to that. So supremacy is in fact kind of a salient concern there, because of not just the post-colonial, colonial and post-colonial experiences, but also the lingering problems with the more massive Western ethnic groups sort of being predominant in the politics, because it is a kind of a representative democracy. And so there's a kind of a majority rule or like plurality clout kind of system, and like the Javanese, Sundanese, and other residents of, say, like Java, of course, the island, and Sumatra, and like Bali, and to some extent anyway, and I want to say Kalimantan, though perhaps less than the others, are the ones who hold all the like media power, and they run the education system, and so forth. So that's a really reductive way of putting it. There are more nuances than I will ever be able to memorize, but so yeah. Speaking of Indonesia generally, I think people who have heard of Indonesia generally are like, okay, it's the largest Muslim majority population.
That's one of the only things I know about it.
Right. That's like one of the key kind of just like world fact book kind of stats. People often say mistakenly, because it's a statistical difference, right? This is like a kind of a factual sort of hair splitting, but like people often say, oh, it's the largest Muslim country. And you're like, well, it's the largest Muslim majority populated country, right? It is a secular state. It has a very strong Islamic bloc because like something like 80 to 90% of the population is Islamic in one way or another, or Muslim in one way or another, or culturally Muslim or whatever it might be. There is again scads of nuance there. Very like sort of there's like folk Islam, just like you see kind of like very like hyper local variants of any given organized religion where people just adapt their prior value systems and beliefs and like aesthetics and hybridize and syncretize with the dominant organized sort of mode. So that's also key to understanding kind of how they do things. It is a very large country. It is the fourth largest population in the world as a state. 2015, it was like 255 million. I think since then, it's reaching up to about 300 million, probably 270,
so
300.
Almost U.S. population.
Yeah, exactly. And it's all scrunched into a landmass that is, I think, like a tenth of the size of the U.S. Wow. Yep. So...
well, to be fair, most of the U.S. is just empty farmland. So,
right, exactly, because of reasons, and
yeah.
So, like, if you think of Indonesia as, because it's these islands and like the ocean there is definitely a part of the terrain, right? You think of all that sea as kind of the more kind of empty land in the States, so like the flyover areas, right? There it's like the ferry over and boat over and flyover areas, and that definitely also partly has defined just the formation of ethnic groups and the dissemination of information and technology, and of course therefore attitudes about each other, which leads to political things, and also embodies political things. So, of course, you're staring at the notes, but I wish I could say, guess how many islands there are in Indonesia, speaking of all that. Yes, you're right.
3.
3, yes. Sumatra, Jawa, and Kalimantan. And of course, they would wish for you to believe that. But yeah, actually, possibly up to 18,000 distinct islands. It is not even a settled number. Like... there are islands born.
What is like the minimum to be considered an island? Because like, some sand pokes out of the water.
Oh yeah, and that's
some people could call it an island.
That's the strangeness of it. I have actually been in open water on a boat, and we ran into, we kind of like intentionally steered toward and kind of rested the boat on a sandbar that was like the size of a fucking queen size mattress, right? And it was just sticking up out of the water. We're like, yeah, that's cool, better not run into that, by accident.
Is that an island?
That's a sandbar, but I have been on an island that was roughly the size of like a house. And that's
okay. So like some of these islands may be the size of a house.
Yeah.
Okay.
In terms of like square footage or
okay.
Yeah. So those are the kinds of little places where like you're watching like a fucking Castaway movie or like a one of these like
are
ocean
there any islands with just
things.
one guy living on there?
Probably, yeah. There's definitely been. I mean, there's a ton of islands where there's just a few people or maybe like a village, and a village is like maybe 10 people, 100 people, 500 people. I don't know.
Gilligan and whoever those other guys are named.
Yeah, right. There's actually there's an ethnic group. I forget what they're called. There's an ethnic group in Indonesia that's so like they're pretty much what you would think of as like the archetypal sea people. It's like Waterworld, where they basically like swim before they can walk. I think they have biological adaptations where they can breathe, like hold their breath longer and stuff like that.
Dang.
Yeah, so like we're talking like Indonesia is not just like an interesting country you don't know much about, but like it's like it it contains worlds, right?
Yeah.
So and then within those worlds are these politics, and then between those worlds are even more politics. So it's far less, even though the state has crafted, as any state wants to do, right, this kind of legitimizing monolithic kind of political and cultural narrative. There is no real monolith of Indonesia. There's only powerful pluralities and stuff. Right, and various kind of apparata that they have put into place to maintain their primacy, or in some cases, right, there's the relative security in the context of more powerful groups. So there's a lot of kind of there's a mode in Indonesia in socially interacting with, at least especially people that you don't know. There's like a tendency to like kind of play your cards real close, right? Like hold them close to your chest and be like just a little more thoughtful about like what you're about to do, because there's just like so many different people with so many different stories, and there's just like you could walk 50 well, not even 50 miles, you could walk fucking 5 miles down and it'll be like totally just somebody else's home, right? That's not like your area anymore, and so I think that it's a very like granular kind of place. And so so there are, speaking of that, and this is in tandem with all this stuff I've been kind of introducing, like if you could guess just how many ethnic/language groups there are that are held to be distinct from each other.
I'm going to guess 300,000.
That's I commend you for going big. The truth is there are 7 billion. No, just kidding. No, there are anywhere between 300 or 1,300 distinct ethnic groups, depending on your source. I actually. Oh yeah, okay. Here it is. The organization that my parents work for does a lot of linguistic research, and there's a website, ethnologue.com, and the number of individual languages listed for Indonesia, based on the research that's been done, is 719.
Dang.
Yeah. Of those, 707 are still living languages, and 12 have passed from this world.
Only 12? Oh my god.
Yeah. Yeah. So basically, you've got roughly 700 like languages going strong that are distinct from each other.
Wow.
Yeah.
I thought it was gonna be like 50 are still around today.
Yeah. No, yeah, 700 is where you're at with that.
Wow.
And then
cool.
The vast majority of these ethnic groups, language groups, are indigenous, or they have migrated to where they live from elsewhere in the archipelago. And then there are minority groups such as Chinese Indonesians of different kind of waves, and that's another wormhole, rabbit hole. As well as, I think in at least Sumatra, there are like communities of like Indian Indonesians and Arab Indonesians. But the ones you usually hear about that are like quote unquote not from there, and that's like, I'm putting that in very heavy quotes because it's a bit like talking about Jews in Europe or that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Is the Chinese Indonesians.
Okay.
Rabbit holes and rabbit holes and rabbit holes. So
yeah.
Right. So the Javanese ethnic group accounts for about 40% of the total population. And so when you have, 300 to 1,300 ethnic groups with 700 languages between them, in a population of, going on 300 million probably at this point, if you're the ethnic group with 40% of the share, right, you're pretty much going to set the pace, right?
Right.
And those, the Javanese are they're from Java, but they're historically they were many of the people if not all the people who created these kind of powerful states and elaborate civilizations that existed before the Dutch, or kind of in tandem with, or in competition with the Dutch, until they were all taken over.
Have you heard of the Selectorate?
Talk to me about that.
Yeah, I just read about it briefly, but it's like out of like an entire like group of people that are, theoretically in control of, a given like institution or whatever. That's like I think that's the like electorate, and then there's a subgroup there that's like the people that actually exercise any control, and then within that group is the people that actually like make the difference between what gets done and what doesn't.
Right.
And it's just like a winning coalition within the very center of everything, and that's called the Selectorate.
Gotcha. Yeah, so I'm looking at the diagram now, where it's like the largest circle that contains everybody is the residents. Within that is the Selectorate circle, and then within the Selectorate circle is the winning coalition, I suppose.
Okay.
Based on this diagram. But yeah, no, that makes sense, and it's definitely
that's how you can have like plurality rule,
Yeah, exactly.
Minority rule.
Essentially, right? Like, and you see this in a lot of different places. You see, basically, states depend on it.
Someone on Twitter was talking today about. Actually, I think that's how this came up. They're talking about how I think it was Pelosi. I don't know. I'm gonna butcher it, but basically, like some senator is like really crucial to like weapons funding or something like that, and Trump was like capitulating to them or something like that, so that that deal could go through. I don't know. I should probably look it up, but it just makes me think of like how there's, even if you just have like someone who's right wing on like one issue in particular, the right can form a coalition with them on that one thing and still like accomplish whatever their insidious goals are, Yeah,
it
could be the same thing here. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, and I'm actually like I'm slightly afraid in terms in terms of the effort it would take to like try to piece apart like the fucking soap opera of Indonesian state politics for the last 70 years since independence, or even before, because it's like any large state, especially with like multiple factions and layers, it's just like you're just like tripping on the worst drugs.
It doesn't really. It's not really important to tease it apart unless you're like in a position to actually do anything about it,
Yeah. Survival seems more pertinent.
But,
yeah. So I'll give you guys for to contextualize things a little bit, and because people don't know much about Indonesia, I mentioned the three power blocks in politics. There is the Islamists, the nationalists, and the communists, and that's another rabbit hole. So basically, as the Dutch were kind of incentivized to like make concessions to like the intellectual class of Indonesia, I should say the East Indies at the time, which were mostly Western Indonesians, such as Javanese, who were in many cases they were like part European, like part Dutch, part Indonesian, and so they were like they had family ties to various Dutch colonials and stuff, and got like Dutch educations, and it started to turn into this whole thing, and then those people started to read various of the popular European political theories and observe the movements and read about the history of what was going on in Europe, and then think about their position as colonially occupied, colonized people, but also people who had ties to the administration in many of these cases. So it turned into them.
I wonder how many of the 700 languages are like Dutch pidgins.
I actually don't know. I mean, most of them are indigenous, which is part of the reason there's so many. But I think that the Jakartan dialect, the Betawi dialect, has some various loanwords from various languages in it. No surprise. I mean, Indonesian has a bunch of loanwords in it from Dutch and from other languages. That's kind of how the language came about. But it's also complicated. But so in the late 19th, early 20th century, these kind of literati of Indonesia and like other kind of politically interested folks from that part of the world, essentially, some of them became more leftists, some of them became more nationalists, and they began to kind of react and interact with colonial rule in more kind of systematic ways, in these kind of like ideological ways, I guess you could say. And then, of course, there were people who were like traditional Islamist types too, who were like, well, we want this kind of uniting institution of Islam to be the way that we go forward from the Dutch. So ultimately, blah, 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 things happen. The Japanese roll in and occupy. Some of the people who want independence end up collaborating with the Japanese in order to kind of achieve goals. And then once the Japanese are kicked out, then this coalition has formed or is forming. I can't remember exactly. But the Islamists, the nationalists, and the communists and leftists as a bloc, essentially form this mega coalition of like uneasy partners to liberate like the entire fucking Dutch East Indies like set of franchises, as a right. So you have not just massive indigenous diversity and linguistic diversity and the fragmentation of islands and the difficulties of things like literacy and obviously economic power in a kind of colonial setting. You also have the massive tension between these three parties, these three kind of coalition members. So they get their independence. The Dutch try to come back. They get their asses handed to them, which is pretty great. And then
whenabouts was this?
Well, that would have been like the mid 40s.
Okay.
Let me peg the exact year. And the Indonesians are very proud of, or at least have been very proud of, the fact that they are, I think, the first Asian country to officially win their independence through a revolutionary war.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. As opposed to through some other arrangements or something. So they declared independence in 1945, and then about 4 years of struggle occurred where they basically
they were a colony through World War II.
Well, so they were occupied by Japan.
Okay.
Yeah. Let me. So, oh God, when did that start? Japanese occupation of Indonesia started in 1942. Okay, because it was opposite side of the ocean from the Japanese. So it started in 1942, and then essentially ended with the Japanese surrender in 1945. Right. So then essentially the Indonesians were like, this is our fucking chance. They declared independence. The Dutch tried to come back. 4 years passed. There was kind of like a bunch of other shit going on, and then the Dutch were unable to politically maintain, like, I guess, legitimacy when they, I think it was like a partial stalemate or something, and so they essentially are like, okay, fine, we'll just sign a treaty and everything's cool, you know. So then from there, the Indonesian coalition, you know, they went through some shit in like the 40s and 50s, where there were, you know, because there was Malaysia, there was Singapore, there were other, you know, parts of Asia that were trying to escape the colonial boot, you know, and Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia all have this some version of this trade language called Malay in common. So Indonesia was like, well, we speak Indonesian Malay, which is called Indonesian. Malaysians, they speak Malayu, just Malaysian Malay, and then Singapore, I think, speaks their own Singaporean sort of version of Malaysian Malay. They're on the same peninsula, so it all works out. Yeah. So anyway, so the important part of this for our kind of just moving forward is two things. One is that coalition that I keep mentioning, and two is Sukarno, who was the first president. So he was one of the architects of the revolution. He was a kind of a wheeler dealer within the movement for independence. You know, he kind of talked to everybody. And so he was one of these founding father types. He was a born politician, very charming. As I recall, he was a bit of a womanizer.
Typical politician.
Yeah, exactly. And then after World War II ended and the so-called Cold War started up, right? And then everybody was like, well, are you the Soviet bloc or the fucking capitalist bloc or whatever? Then, of course, there was a bunch of these countries that started the non-aligned movement, regardless of their actual state politics, right? They were like, we don't want to fuck around with this bullshit between the U.S. and the USSR, you know, or like NATO and the USSR. So Sukarno drew Indonesia into the non-aligned movement, but was also interested in like socialism, or at least was like friendly to it. So then, of course, to skip through all
like
this
Marxist centrism.
Yeah, something like that, you know, and like he was definitely a fucking nationalist in the sense that he was like a big fan of what he and these other people had created as Indonesia, you know. But I don't think, from what I've read, that he was like the kind of diehard like chauvinist nationalist that you think of when you say that word.
Marxist Keynesianist.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So he was like, you know, okay, like, how are we going to continue to spin this bizarre creature called Indonesia if we have this kind of winning coalition with so many internal tensions and all this? So he was talking to China, he was talking to Japan, he was blah, 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 blah. And continued to be the president. And in the mid-'60s, a bunch of other shit popped off where, you know, and the history of that has been largely like concealed under wraps, very murky. But what happened is ultimately there was an allegation that there had been a failed communist coup, and then the military, which as you might expect is full of chauvinist nationalist types.
Those guys usually like communists, right?
right, yeah. So
they're
then
talking about how they love reading books and, you know, comrades
sharing things. Yeah, right. So and then part of it was that the allegations were that the communists, you know, members of the Communist Party had gone and tried to like assassinate a bunch of generals or something, you know. And again, I'm reducing this. This is like, there's this whole fucking lore about this. And it's also like the details have not always been clear either. So then they're like, oh, they tried to like fucking kill our military leadership. So of course the military reacts to that. Well, who fucking knows if that's really how it happened? It could have been a false flag. I'm gonna just assume that it was personally. But there were probably other things at play as well that we'll just like it was a Reichstag fire event and they just fell for it, right? Everybody fell for it.
I'm like kind of fully on board with post-truth. Like, if a lie is advantageous and it, may as well be true, then you know what? It's true.
Yeah. Pretty much. Exactly. So that's a great attitude to take when talking about like Indonesian politics, actually, because that's pretty much how it all runs. Yeah, it's all insanity. Very, very well contained, bottled up, quiet insanity. So the military lost a bunch of generals who were murdered spectacularly. But since we never were able to verify who murdered them, then the blame was very aggressively put on the Communist Party. So then Suharto, this military general guy, he basically threw Sukarno in house arrest and kind of was like, emergency powers, activate, and then and then said, hey, all these communists are super disrespectful. They tried to destroy our culture, and also they're anti-Islam. So then all these Islamists were like, oh, fuck that. So basically between the Islamists and like the kind of like the approval of the military and probably some participation, and also just like a bunch of like hoodlums, just generally just hoodlums, 500,000 people were slaughtered in like a space of, I think, a few months. Just like grassroots mass murder, and if you ever watch the documentary The Act of Killing, that is a very dark, obviously, kind of look back, where they actually interview some of the kind of just like, local gangster types who took part in this murder, this slaughter. And like pretty much all of these other people who did it, they just straight up got away with it because the government was all about it, right? So it was this horrific spree that also resulted in like the imprisonment of a lot of like alleged leftists and stuff. And like my parents were acquainted with a guy. I remember this story from like the 90s when we were there. So basically this guy was, he's fucking middle-aged at that time already because he was like a young adult in the 60s. And he said, oh yeah, one of these acquaintances of mine basically like said that I was a fucking communist plotter because I had a hot wife and he wanted to get rid of me. And so he just fucking said I was a communist, and off to jail I go for like 10 fucking years. And when I got out, she'd married this guy.
Jesus.
So yeah, cool shit, right? So stuff like that just happens in these crisis scenarios where like there's this pressure like this, right? It's like you have to think about that when we talk about like domestic like partisan conflict, is that shit like that will in fact happen. It's not just this kind of pure like team versus team shit. It's like you'll get the fucking worst people doing the worst shit to you, and people who didn't ask for anything of them, So anyway, so that's cool. So then Suharto consolidated his regime by playing the factions against each other. He would sort of like press one down slightly, press another down slightly. He'd just be like, hey, shut the fuck up for a few years. Like you're you're underfoot. It's really annoying, right? And so his regime, when he basically officially took power, he very totally not ominously named it the New Order. Like it's just like, this is the New Order. This is
really liked the band New Order.
Yeah, right. And so that was 1966, I think, was the year, because he called it the generation of 66.
Might have been before the band a little bit.
Yeah. So when he took power, he talked about this generation of 1966, and it was like straight up just fascist shit. Like he was just like, the new generation is young and virile and strong and not timid and decisive and like all this shit. And you're like, wow, this is so cool.
Whipping people up to do fascism.
Yep. And so
putting on my fascism boots and my fascism gloves to
right. Do a fascism.
Do some of that
Yep.
stuff.
Yeah. So, him being a horrific, murderous fascist general in charge of an extremely resource-rich post-colonial country, he obviously hit it off really well with the Americans. so between, his regime shit and his need/greed to deal with the Western, extractive powers, he basically just like gave them the fucking red carpet, and and it was already bad enough. Like it was already bad enough before when like the states were like, oh, so we would like to do some stuff, and I was like, okay, maybe a little bit, and now he's just like, nope, doors are open, come on in, just fuck everybody.
Trade policy before that,
Let's see. I would imagine so. I mean, so they've got like a kind of a constitutional thing called the Panchasila, which is like the 5 principles. Actually, a lot of Asian countries have something like this. And I'll call, so it's the 5 principles, Panchasila. The first one is belief in the Almighty God, but they construe that as any one of the 5 approved major religions in Indonesia. So Islam, Protestantism, Catholicism, Hinduism, and Buddhism, right? So basically, as long as you're one of those 5 and you're registered that way, and you do have to register, then like you're set. It's like, oh yeah, like this is kind of this like pluralistic, like you're part of an organized religion, so you're set, you're good, you're moral, we can go by that. The second principle is a just and civilized humanity, so kind of like humanism in a sense, like human ethics, whatever. 3, a unified Indonesia, so just kind of like a nation statism. 4, democracy led by
so
wisdom by consensus.
I found this article here it's talking about the economy under Sukarno, and there was like a hyperinflationary period before Suharto took over.
Yeah, and that's, I wouldn't be surprised if
so they had a bunch of debts.
And
this line was really great. Where is it? Foreign exchange earnings from the country's plantation sector fell from 442 million in 1958 to 330 million in 1966. Plantation sector is really evocative,
really
there.
Cool. Yeah. Oh, they still have that. So and then okay, so the 5th principles, which is what I was sort of trying to get to in terms of like their like philosophy on all this shit, is like social justice for all Indonesians, which I think Sukarno envisioned as including socialism, like state socialism of some kind, like social democracy maybe. And there are some institutions that kind of like hold that up, but so like I was gonna say, like, basically they were like being exploited and had these problematic like debt relations, as you pulled up, but at the same time, like under Sukarno, he was trying to probably, from what I remember, he was trying to figure out a way to like continue to serve the needs of the masses in some way, and then Suharto was like, fuck it. Right. So, and this includes, the lead up to the New Order and the takeover of Suharto, includes the taking of what was called, Jesus Christ, called Irian Jaya, for a long time, which is now known as Papua and West Papua. Irian Jaya literally means like glorious conquest. And it was taken, it was taken from or given by the Dutch to Indonesia in like 62. But there was like this Grasberg mine that was there, was grandfathered in so that this American corporation could essentially keep control over it. But we'll get to that. So decades pass. Suharto is getting old. He's starting to kind of lose a little grip in the 90s, right? Like just a little.
Okay.
And then the Asian financial crisis happens, which just like plunges, all of Asia into this fucking quagmire. And then within a year, there are like enough mass demonstrations. And I think it was, again, partly like the elites were kind of like, this isn't working for us anymore. So we're going to like get behind the unrest. So, 97 is when it really hits Indonesia hard. And then 98, it continues. And that's when the demonstrations and this investigation into Suharto's finances happen. Right, so you can see there's a ton of unrest in 98. Really, really dark shit. Like I mentioned, the Chinese Indonesians, they have a kind of an awkward position in Indonesia because of all this prejudice and because of their economic status. Often they are slightly well off and something like that. So there was all these anti-Chinese riots by Indonesian nativists, I should say. And like I know people who were directly affected by it, people who were Chinese Indonesians who were literally in the middle of this shit, and it was like the most terrifying thing they had to go through, and a lot of them ran off to the States or elsewhere because it was so fucking bad. Literally read about, trigger warning for anybody, you skip forward like 10 seconds, but like a family was dragged out of their house, and the teenage daughter was raped in front of her mother, and the mother was raped in front of their father, and all this kind of shit. So cool, fucked up shit. Meanwhile, East Timor was fucking boiling. Maluku, which is an eastern province, was boiling, and Sulawesi got embroiled in that particular conflict as well. And shit was going on in Irian Jaya as well. So that's late 90s. So because it was discovered through investigation and dissent that Suharto and his whole family and all their buddies were embezzling and had embezzled like billions and billions of dollars. That's what you do as a fucking dictator. So like, no big surprise, but also they figured it out and they were able to prove it. So people were like, all right, fuck this guy, and the government was basically unable to, with all their sort of fiscal foreign policy woes and also domestic conflicts and stuff, just they're like, okay, fine, okay, like we'll do something new now, and Suharto was out, and his vice president stepped in, BJ Habibie, and kind of navigated them through that for about a year or like several months. Then they had some kind of election. I don't think like a direct election. But this guy, Abdurrahman Wahid.
What a great name BJ Habibi is.
Yeah, right? It's just like everybody loves that fucking name. So then the next guy's Abdurrahman Wahid, who was like, he was an old, kind of an old stalwart from like back in like the bad old days of like getting their independence and shit. And so he was just fucking ancient by the time he got in. Like, he was like, I think he was in a wheelchair, he couldn't really see anymore, but he was there and he was like this old wise man.
Love being an old stalwart.
Right.
That's what I aspire to be.
Right. So he lasted about 2 years, from 1999 to 2001. And then people were like, all right, man, like you just get out of here. Like, let's
you're not stalwart enough anymore.
Yeah. You're not really keeping up. So his vice president took over, and that was Megawati Sukarno Putri, which is one of Sukarno's daughters. So the daughter of the first president is now, by kind of like just random stuff in politics, she ascends as the president, and she lasted 3 years. And also, her first name Megawati is not a reference to the brightness of a bulb, right? But I always wondered. I actually wonder what it means in like Javanese or whatever it is, but I never learned because I don't speak Javanese. So she's out in 2004. New guy, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, or what they call SBY for short, just because like his name is like long as fuck. Elected 2004, re-elected 2009. So he kind of stabilizes the new regime. What they call the Reformasi era, the reform era. So he kind of stabilizes that. Obviously he's a president, so he's a bastard, but he is one of the better bastards out there, I guess, based on what I've heard. And then Joko Widodo, who is the current president, he was first elected in 2014.
Another one of my favorite names in politics.
Oh yeah,
very funny
dope name.
Joko
Right. Yeah, and his nickname is Jokowi, just one word, Jokowi. Okay. And he was kind of like, his parents were like nobody, apparently. Like his dad was a woodworker from one of these cities. He's a fucking Metallica fan. Like this just chill dude who then kind of accidentally became the mayor.
He is a bastard. He likes Metallica.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Things are different over there, Yeah. So he kind of like, bounced into being mayor of this major city, and then from there he kind of got into a presidential campaign. And I sometimes I wonder, like, did they pick him because of his narrative, like his story, or did he actually want to become president? But he kind of got like this popular or maybe populist surge, and won the election in 2014. Had kind of an Obama effect, hopey changey stuff.
Had some just to clarify, because I just found out about this like last week, but I learned that Canada's system, they don't like elect the top executive or whatever, like the prime minister.
Really? Are they just born into it, or like?
Well, it's the whatever the winning parties are. Oh my fucking god, this dog.
Oh, you know what? You're right. I remember that now. Yeah. I remember that. Yeah. Yeah. Like you elect a party and the party chooses, right?
Yeah. Basically, the PM is appointed by the winning party. Yeah. The plurality party in the coalition, I guess.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And so I didn't know if it was that or if they actually elect theirs. Yeah, my car was about to get towed. So.
Oh shit. Well, speaking of state repression. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, well, it was convenient because I was like, my bladder was going to explode, and I was just about to actually ask for a break. So hey, we all win. So where was I? So you all settled in.
Joko Widodo.
Okay.
Yeah.
Joko Widodo. All right, so here we are. We're in the era of Jokowi, our kind of popularly elected, Obama effect guy. Who very quickly became a Macron effect kind of guy. Just kind of like very placid, very mundane kind of dude, just kind of, pedaling the state along like a tricycle. So this is, we're in the sort of the quote unquote democratic era since Reformasi began, and so the kind of hopey changey vibe and like the promises to help people economically, like fixing the cost of cement, which is important for like local developments and construction and stuff, especially out in the East where people don't make any fucking money,
Right.
He also promised a fiber optic network across the entire archipelago, which is, when
quite a project.
When I heard about that, I was like, God damn, dude, like that's a big fucking promise. And I think they did it in like to some degree. I don't know if they completed what they promised, but they are in the midst apparently of doing it. There's so many fucking things going on in that country. I can never keep track. But yeah, so so we've gotten through to this Jokowi guy. It's now 2019. Over the past several years, I want to say, has existed the where is the date here? Okay, since 2002, the government of Indonesia has had this like agency called, in Indonesian, it's the Komisi Pemberantasan Korupsi, abbreviated KPK, KPK, and it means the Corruption Eradication Commission, right? So in any good serious state, you know, you're going to use the term corruption to attack or undermine the behaviors of anyone not aligned with your agenda, right? Like everything is fucking corruption except when you say it's not. You know, if it's not aligned with you, you know, it's toast. Corruption is kind of this moral thing. So since Suharto and his family were kicked out partly due to this investigation into embezzling, cronyism, etc., and that was this huge popular surge against them. And since Indonesia has been dealing with like the debts and the trade and the exploitation and all this like international domestic political baggage, bureaucratic competition, party competition, police and military brutality, police and military bribery, black markets. They are very anti-drugs, so there's like drug running, all this shit, right? So it's very easy to be like, corruption bad, we are good, right? And then just kind of delineate things from there. But however, it's also important, I think, to understand that like having something like that is better than what they had previously, which is that the state didn't give a fuck, right? Like Suharto just ran that shit like a fucking private casino, essentially. So, so the KPK, the Eradication Commission, has been kind of like, from what I've seen, a fairly popular tool that the people can hope will at least do some good to keep various overly interested political parties from, or political factions or groups from totally overtaking the state or military apparatus. Even though, again, it's not a cure, it's not perfect. There's probably a lot of biases involved in how this thing runs. So this is an important agency. But in the meantime, there's been a lot of bullshit continuing to go on in Indonesia. And apologies also if I'm kind of jumping around at this point, because, like I said, there's just like so much shit going on.
It's complex.
It's complex. It's hard to tie it all together simply. I don't always know how things connect precisely.
And none of us know anything about the subject.
Right. So I'm like, I know more than probably everybody listening currently. Right. I know more than you, obviously, but I've also been out of the country for 10 years. And partly due to like the diversity in language, like I've been reading up on Indonesian Twitter, and the the like, when you're like a fucking normie looking at Twitter like in English, right? You're just like, you generally no idea what's going on, right? You're just like, there's just like a whole lot of inside jokes and like weird conventions, like just the like most meme contextual language
form of English.
Contextual, exactly, right. And so you're like, okay, like these are words from English, and I speak English, but I don't know what these words are supposed to mean, right?
Individually, I know what all these words mean, but why are they together?
Why are they together? Exactly. So I've been having a similar experience with like Indonesian Twitter, because that's also very high context. and there's all this slang, and like just like anywhere else, every city has its own dialect and slang and everything like that. But perhaps in an even deeper way than you would expect between, say, like New York or New York and Philly, or New York and Boston, or like LA and fucking San Francisco, right?
In
It's
Java,
like
they say trippin', but in Sulawesi, they say luncheon.
pretty much, yeah. And so you're just like going through this and you're like sifting through it and just gradually going insane. But it's so funny watching, like, just also seeing like all the people reacting to any given post, like high context slang post, where like they all get it, right? Because they're from there. And so, and I'm just sitting there and like, I feel like so fucking stupid. Like,
Just pretending.
but also, yeah, it's just impossible to actually, like, you know, there's a lot of Europeans who like speak like 6 fucking European languages, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, in Indonesia, it's not uncommon for you to speak like maybe 2 or 3 of the local or regional languages, especially if you're like an urban person who's very literate. So you speak, I speak English. Of course, I speak Indonesian. We all speak fucking Indonesian, you know, the official language. And I also speak Sundanese, which is the local, you know, ethnic majority language. And then I also speak, you know, like the dialect of Chinese that my particular family speaks at home, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And then I also speak some other local, like fucking argot, you know, that I learned on the street because we're all teens or something, you know, that kind of shit. So I'm like, I don't have this anymore, you know. I used to swim in that a little bit, and I don't have it anymore because I'm a fucking old man, you know. So it's been interesting trying to track what's connected to what and why people have different attitudes about it. And of course, you know, you got bootlicker Indonesians, just like you got bootlicker Americans, right? So you're just sifting through, and then you're like, oh wait, I think I'm reading tweets from like a bad person, you know, like like I don't like this. You know?
I had that experience a lot on. I was trying to read like Venezuelan Twitter when all the Venezuelan coup stuff was happening, and you know, my Spanish isn't good at all. I took 4 years of it, but I'm pretty useless in it. Like I learned more from working with Colombian people for like, you know, 13 months than I did in any amount of Spanish class. But yeah, there was a lot of posts where I was like, I think this person is not a good one.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's because I don't know all the words,
right.
You know.
Right, exactly. You're like, wait, are they being sarcastic or serious?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So
So
it's like blah 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 homosexual, and it's like, oh, okay, this guy not
damn
good.
it. Right. That's an asshole. Yeah. So like, so getting back to like, you know, Jokowi and like the KPK and their kind of navigation through economic difficulty. So in the past, you know, couple of decades since the Kris, the monetary crisis, financial crisis, the Indonesian middle class has actually been kind of like struggling through it, and loosely defined middle class, you know, income. So Indonesia is this kind of emerging economy, middle power. They weathered the recession pretty well relative to other states, and so the last, like, say 10 years have been, you know, while not always great, in terms of just relative position, they've done okay. But like, there's all this other shit that's been going on too, you know, despite and or because of people like Jokowi in charge, you know, like, again, Jokowi, hope he change you guy, making a lot of promises, but the government is still the government, right? You know, these factions are still in place. The Suharto era is still in living memory, and foreign exploitation, as well as domestic sort of exploitation of the state's holdings, you know, which it considers to be Indonesia, right? Continue. So you've got, speaking of things like the plantation sector, you know, you've got palm oil, which is a big cash crop of sorts there.
You cut out. You said palm oil.
Palm oil, yeah, and I said it's basically kind of like a cash crop there.
Yeah,
it's very very extractive, very problematic.
A lot of candies.
Yeah.
If you eat non-chocolate candy, you're probably eating the corpses of orangutans.
Yeah. Oh God, don't even get me into the fucking wildlife destruction. Christ.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, oh man, I just stories and stuff. So yeah. So you've got the palm oil, you've got the lumber practices, right? So, Kalimantan, Borneo, right? The island of Borneo, um, upon which the province of Kalimantan sits. That's
Borneo
basically
like the real name for it, or is that like a colonial name?
Man, there's so many names. I actually don't know. It's probably a colonial name.
Okay.
Especially because, like, if you think about a lot of the people who were indigenous, who are indigenous to this place, but the people who were their ancestors, who, when the Dutch came along or the Portuguese or British came along, they might have a name for the island. They might not. They might have a name for the whole region.
Kalimantan is the native. Yeah, I just looked it up.
Kalimantan is what we call the province. So, we're getting into the weeds here. So Borneo is that island, the big sort of delta-shaped island. It is Wikipedia now. It's the third largest island in the world, and it's the largest island in Asia, like flat out.
Yeah, go to the etymology, and it has it there.
Yeah. It is known by many names. It is known as Borneo. Oh, after Brunei. Okay, so you were right. Derived from European contact. Yeah, so then there's all this possible, could be from Sanskrit, blah, blah, blah. Indonesians call it Kalimantan. Okay. But you could have just told me you were in
Wikipedia. I was. Sorry.
Damn you. You beat me to it. So yeah, but yeah, Kalimantan is definitely like, that's what the province is called for sure. And that's most of the island anyway, so fuck it. Right, so that's like the lungs of Indonesia. Kind of, so you take the Amazon in South America, right? And that's a big fucking...
So Borneo is the other giant rainforest, basically.
Exactly, yeah. There's a bunch in Papua as well, but Borneo is the one you hear about. And there's a lot of like illegal logging and probably like semi-illegal logging there. So you can literally just look this up and fucking probably Google images. Just like the deforestation of Borneo or of Kalimantan. And it's just like the Amazon is just like everywhere else. It's like you start with like a ton of forests and you end up with basically a fucking desert. So that's depressing. And that's just one thing that just continues to happen. It, I think it's obviously continuing to happen, but I don't know if it has shifted in volume, like if it's intensified, but things are just not that great. And then, of course, once lumber is taken from the land and it's clear, then they turn it into things like palm oil plantations, which themselves, as such a lucrative cash crop, incentivize the clearance of land. So it's like this sort of vicious circle that happens. And as part of the process, they're not just taking trees away, right? Anybody who knows anything knows that means they're destroying ecosystem, and so forth. And so
yeah, the
wildlife.
Bornean orangutan is critically endangered. I'm looking at a picture of like this little baby one. It's so fucking cute, man. Like,
right? Like, how can you just right?
How do people have that impulse? It's crazy.
Oh my god! I think what we need to do, it's insanity. It's just a disease.
We need to fund giant blimps to go around and show Dunstan checks in and save the orangutans.
Yes.
After you watch that movie, I don't think it's possible to clear cut rainforests like that.
Yeah, I fucking love it.
And if that doesn't work, we'll show them Nausicaa and the wrath of the giant insects that they'll invoke.